The emotional trigger that makes you feel sorry for the wrong people. Most people don't realize they can be emotionally manipulated into defending the wrong person until it's already happened. And by the time they notice, they've already taken a side, already justified behavior, already invested emotionally in someone who never deserved it. There is a very specific psychological trigger that creates this effect. It is subtle, it feels natural, and it is extremely powerful when used correctly. And once you understand it, you will start to recognize it in conversations, in relationships, and even in public narratives. This trigger is known as sympathy activation through perceived vulnerability. It works by presenting someone as emotionally exposed, misunderstood, or unfairly treated. And when the human brain detects vulnerability, it responds almost automatically with protection, empathy, and support. This mechanism is deeply connected to what psychologists call affective empathy. When we see or hear something that signals emotional pain, our brain mirrors that state. We don't just understand it intellectually. We feel it. And when we feel it, our judgment begins to shift. This is where the problem begins. Because the moment empathy is activated, critical thinking starts to weaken. The brain prioritizes emotional response over analytical evaluation. This is consistent with dual process theory, as described by Daniel Kahneman. The fast, intuitive system takes over, and the slower, rational system becomes less active. Now imagine a situation. Someone tells you a story where they were treated unfairly. They emphasize how much they tried, how much they cared, how misunderstood they were. They describe their emotional pain in detail. They do not lie directly, but they frame the situation in a way that places them as the victim. At that moment, something happens inside you. You begin to feel for them. You start to align with their perspective. And without realizing it, you begin to fill in the gaps in their favor. This is not because you lack intelligence. It is because your brain is responding exactly as it is designed to respond. Now, here is where the manipulation becomes more precise. The person does not only present vulnerability, they also remove context. They leave out their own role in the situation. They simplify the narrative. They create a clear emotional direction. And your brain follows that direction because it feels coherent and emotionally satisfying. This is closely related to framing effects, another well-documented psychological principle. The way information is presented influences how it is interpreted. And when the frame is emotional, the interpretation becomes biased. Let's take a real-life example. A colleague says, "I've been working nonstop, and no one appreciates what I do. Yesterday, I got blamed for something that wasn't even my fault." Immediately, you feel sympathy. You see them as overwhelmed, possibly mistreated. But what you do not hear is what happened before, what decisions they made, what responsibilities they may have ignored. The narrative is incomplete, but emotionally convincing. And that is enough. Because the brain prefers a clear emotional story over a complex factual one. Now combine this with timing. The story is told in a moment where you are not expecting to evaluate it critically. It is casual. It is conversational. There is no signal that you need to analyze. So you don't. Instead, you respond emotionally. You agree. You support. You validate. And in doing so, you become part of the narrative. This is how the emotional trigger works. It does not force you. It guides you. It shapes your perception in a way that feels natural, but is actually constructed. And once you have taken a side, something even stronger happens. You begin to defend that position. This is where the principle of commitment and consistency comes in, as described by Robert Cialdini. Once you publicly or internally commit to a perspective, your brain works to remain consistent with it. You justify it. You reinforce it, even when new information appears. This is why people often continue to support someone even after evidence suggests they shouldn't, because changing position would create internal conflict. So instead, they maintain the belief. And the emotional trigger continues to operate. Recognizing this emotional trigger is not enough. Because when it happens in real time, it does not feel like manipulation. It feels like compassion. It feels like understanding. It feels like doing the right thing. And that is exactly why it is so effective. The first step to protecting yourself is learning to identify the pattern, not just the emotion. When someone presents themselves as a victim, ask yourself a simple question. What is missing from this story? This question alone can change your entire perception, because it shifts your focus from what is being said to what is not being said. Let's take another example. In a relationship, one partner says, I give everything to this relationship, and I get nothing back. I'm always the one trying. This statement is emotionally powerful. It immediately creates sympathy. But if you pause and look deeper, you may find that the situation is more complex. Perhaps their way of trying includes controlling behavior. Perhaps their expectations are unrealistic. Perhaps the other person has been responding in ways that are not being acknowledged. Without that full context, your emotional response is incomplete. Another example, a manager tells you, "I'm under so much pressure from above, and no one understands how difficult it is for me." Again, this creates sympathy. It positions them as burdened and isolated. But what is not said? How do they treat their team? Do they pass that pressure downward? Do they create additional stress for others? If you only respond to the emotional signal, you miss the full picture. This is where you must slow down. Slowing down is one of the most powerful psychological defenses. It interrupts the automatic response. It allows your analytical thinking to return. Instead of immediately agreeing or supporting, you create space. You can say, "That sounds difficult. What exactly happened?" This keeps the conversation open, but invites more detail. It moves the interaction from emotional framing to factual exploration. Another technique is emotional separation. You acknowledge the feeling, but you do not attach your judgment to it. For example, "I understand that you feel this way, but I'd like to understand the full situation." This creates a boundary between empathy and agreement. And this boundary is critical because empathy does not require you to take sides. This is a common misunderstanding. People believe that if they do not agree, they are not being supportive. But in reality, true understanding requires clarity, not blind alignment. There is also a deeper layer to consider. Manipulators often repeat this pattern over time. They consistently present themselves as the victim. They consistently create sympathy. And they consistently avoid accountability. If you notice a pattern where someone is always the one being wronged, always misunderstood, always unfairly treated, this is a signal. Because in real life, responsibility is rarely one-sided. Another real-world scenario. A friend constantly tells you stories about how others have hurt them. Over time, you begin to see the world through their lens. You start to distrust the people around them. You align with their perspective. But if you step back, you may notice that every story follows the same structure. They are always the victim. Others are always the problem. This repetition is not coincidence. It is a pattern of influence. And once you recognize it, you can choose to respond differently. You do not have to reject the person. You do not have to confront them aggressively. But you can stop automatically agreeing. You can remain neutral, observant, balanced. And this is where your control returns. Because the emotional trigger only works when your response is automatic. The moment you pause, question, and separate emotion from judgment, the mechanism weakens. You begin to see people more clearly, not just how they present themselves, but how they behave over time. And that is the difference between being emotionally guided and being psychologically aware. Because in the end, the goal is not to eliminate empathy. The goal is to protect it, to use it consciously, not automatically. To understand people without being controlled by how they want to be seen. And once you reach that point, something changes. You stop feeling sorry for the wrong people. And you start seeing the full picture. The end.